Today, on this episode of The Crossover, we will be discussing the United States Presidency, past, present, and future, with best-selling author and presidential history expert, Professor Jeffrey Engel. Find out how the role of the free world leader has evolved over time and what this all means for the fate of the USA. Much more on this episode of The Crossover. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be talking with Professor Jeffrey Engel about U.S. presidential history. A lot of hot topics to discuss.
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
Hey, Jeffrey, how you doing? Wow, well, that was smooth.
Surprisingly
the whole
so.
login was very smooth. I'm glad you were able to join so easily. Awesome. Well, listen, I'm going to do a brief intro just while everyone's logging on here. We have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Jeffrey Engel. He is a nationally recognized expert on presidential history. He's a best-selling author as background with 12 written or edited books on American foreign policy. Currently, he's the founding director of the Center for Presidential History and Professor of History at Southern Methodist University. He is also a senior fellow of the Norwegian Nobel Institute and of the John Goodwin Tower Center for Political Studies. As background, Dr. Engel graduated magna cum laude from Cornell University and spent some time at Oxford as well. He received his master's and doctorate from the University of Wisconsin and did his postdoctoral fellowship at Yale. He was named the prestigious Bernath Prize lecturer by the Society of Historians and named the Professor of the Year at SMU. He is a frequent media contributor. I've seen him on MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, NPR, and BBC. And his writings have been all over, including USAToday, LA Times, International Journal, Dallas Morning News, and the Washington Post. So here today to discuss the very hot topic of U.S. presidency, past, current, and future. So again, thank you, Jeff. It's really great to have you on. Well, let's just start with some basics, right? So the U.S. presidency has really evolved since George Washington. Give us kind of a stark contrast. How does the presidency in the 21st century compare to the presidency that was back when George Washington
it's a great question. I think it's a foundational question for how we understand our politics, and not only evolving over history, but our politics today in particular. And the first point to make is that the presidency today is nothing at all what the architects of the Constitution envisioned. In fact, we know this very clearly because the article of the Constitution that describes the presidency is, of course, Article 2. Article 1 is what describes Congress, the legislature. And people at the time, and those who wrote the Constitution, consider that the legislature was actually the place where most government would get done and most problems would get worked out. It's almost laughable today to think that most problems would get worked out in the legislature. But instead, the executive branch, they really focus on the idea that this was the executor of congressional action. That if you think about it, government is conceived of and done and policymaking constructed in the legislature, and then the president's job is just to make it happen, if you will. That obviously almost was never the case from the very beginning, but we do see a steady increase, not only through the 19th century, but in particular on steroids in the 20th century, as essentially America's engagement with the world has increased, as the speed of communications and the speed of travel has brought the United States more day to day into contact with the world. The need for an effective executive has increased exponentially. So when we think about the overall trajectory of presidential history, when we start thinking about the way in which the president has evolved to today, we usually start around the start of the 20th century, with what famous historian Arthur Schlesinger referred to as the rise of the imperial president, essentially a president who acts more like a king than anything else. And that's a steady trajectory through the Second World War and through the Cold War, that essentially every time the state has seen different problems, and national security problems in particular, the basic response has been to give more responsibility to the executive. So the president today is, especially as the only national elected office that we have in this country, is the person who most people in America think is the government. Whereas in 1789, if you had asked who is the government, people would have had a whole list of folks, their local legislatures, their local commissioners, their local governments. the national legislature before they got to the president. So it's really an inverse of how the founders really thought about things at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a real stark comparison as opposed to, like you said, what it was set up to be. And speaking of that, right, there's a current system of checks and balances that may have worked in the past, but as the presidential power has increased, like you said, is the current system of checks and balances, is that enough, or does that need to be modified?
It's not working. I mean, I think let's all concede that, right now, over 90% of Americans in a recent poll that I just saw this week think that America is heading in the wrong direction. Interestingly enough, if you want to break that down, 85% of Democrats think the country is heading in the wrong direction, which is significant because, as I mentioned before, there's a Democrat in the White House, and people naturally today associate the government with whichever party holds the White House, not necessarily Congress. So I don't think that there's any question that the Congress has tried repeatedly over the course of the 20th century to bring back some of the power that has been ceded to the imperial presidency. Best examples, of course, being after Watergate and after Vietnam, when Congress really went on if you will, a legislative spree to try to pull back a lot of powers, national security-wise and otherwise. And I have to say, I rank it as a large failure at this point, that we are at a stage where the large structural ways in which Congress was supposed to reel in a president, I would argue, are simply not working in any way. And I want to make sure I say this in a nonpartisan way, because the last two presidential impeachments that we've had, which, by the way, are only two of only three that we've ever had in the entire country's history formally, but the last two that we had broke down entirely on partisan lines. That is to say, obviously, President Trump was not impeached either of the two times that he was impeached because Republicans refused, by and large, to consider whether or not the claims against him were legitimate. And by the same token, the same with Bill Clinton and Democrats back in the 1990s. And this is really significant because the founders would have desired that the people voting in the Congress, especially in the Senate, perceived that their responsibility was to the Senate and to the country, not to their party. So if the major congressional checks that are involved are essentially not being used because of pure partisan reasoning, well, that tells me that the checks are basically worthless at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a real problem. Like you said, you have the presidential power increasing exponentially and the system of checks and balances not working without a realistic way to modify them is what it sounds like. How would the U.S. presidency compare to other modern industrialized countries in terms of power, in terms of individual power?
There's the American president is actually much more powerful in many ways, and yet simultaneously less powerful. And I'll try to explain that. First of all, important structural component that everybody needs to appreciate, and this is going back to essentially your 8th grade civics class. I apologize if it's too obvious for everyone, but remember, most countries separate the head of state and the head of government. That is to say, most countries have essentially a ceremonial office, the king, if you will, or in Germany, the president of Germany, whose job it is to, give out medals to the Olympic winners and to congratulate scientists and to cut ribbons and stuff whatnot, and then leave the actual governments to somebody else. We in this country have combined those two posts. So we have to remember when we think about the president's responsibility that we essentially have made them ceremonial and functional. So in terms of actual power, the President of the United States, I think, is fundamentally more powerful for the reason that the Congress cannot check the president unless it actively chooses to. And frankly, as I said, in this age of partisanship, we have not seen a lot of active checking of the president. Now, I want to give a complete counter thought to that, to note that in most parliamentary systems, the prime minister is there, of course, because they are the head of the government that has a majority, or at least a coalition majority in government. Say Britain, say Israel is another possibility, though frankly they're a little bit more dysfunctional than we are at this point in terms of forming coalitions. That essentially when that government chooses to do something, they have the votes. So you would not get in a government such as Britain the bog down that you have today of the executive saying, I really want an infrastructure bill, and Congress saying, well, let's negotiate about it. You've cut out the middleman. in essence. So in the national security sphere in particular, the American president is, I think, almost impervious to congressional oversight, whereas in terms of getting things done, the president actually is much weaker in our system than it would be in a parliamentary system. So we're essentially less efficient, but the president can do more in the areas that he or she has the aptitude and the interest.
Now, speaking about candidates for presidency, it seems like over the last 10, 20 years, these candidates have become so extreme, right? They're either all the way to the right, all the way to the left. There's like almost no moderate individuals that are running for presidency. Why has that happened, and how do we fix
the first
that?
answer is a lot easier to answer than the second. The first answer, why has it happened, is that this has actually been a problem across the board, that our country, not just on the presidential level, but on every level, has, essentially because of the stark divisions, not just politically, but culturally, between Democrats and Republicans. People don't think of themselves even as members of parties anymore, so much as members of tribes, I would argue. And I would point out to all the people watching that, remember, you are statistically much more likely as an American to change religions than you are to change political parties. So this tells us that political parties are really the central identity that we have as Americans at this point. So because we have a primary system, that is to say, obviously, the people who vote in each individual party primary typically come from only that primary, and the people who vote in primaries are typically much more likely to vote than people in general elections. We've seen in both parties, essentially, the most rabid and active members of the party, who are typically on the ideological extreme of the party, are the ones who have an undue influence in selecting the primary candidates. You add on top of that we are in an extraordinarily gerrymandered situation across the country at this point, whereas to say that there's essentially very, very few actual competitive races around the country. What that essentially means is you have a situation, especially for Congress, where you are extraordinarily likely to win your election if you win the primary and your primary is the only election that matters within that district. That is to say, if you're in a district that's 80% Republican or 80% Democrat, you win that primary, you're going to win in the general. This, by the way, is exacerbated by the presidential standard, presidential campaigns, and in the sense that, again, primary voters have an outsized influence. And the way that we've set up the delegate system in this country, which, by the way, has only been the case since around 1972, 73. There's been a series of changes in the 60s that essentially brought us to this place. And also, by the way, some changes after the 2012 election, especially on the Republican side, that was supposed to eliminate the possibility of a brokered convention, essentially streamlined the primaries so that whoever got the most votes in a primary got the most delegates. Now, that seems obvious in some ways, except what you had was a situation in 2016, which is absolutely fascinating, where for almost the first 2/3 of the Republican primaries, Donald Trump never got above 35% of the primary voters in the Republican Party. So not even a majority of the primary voters, but he won each of those delegates. He won each of those campaigns. They became more winner take all than they had been before. So again, we have a series of structural and ideological problems in this country that are driving the extremes to become more powerful on the right and the left. Again, leaving the vast majority of Americans who like to consider themselves in the middle, essentially frustrated with both ends at this point. I wish I could be more optimistic about this, but that's the situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, it sounds like a very tough situation. I think we're all kind of feeling that pain. Along those lines, do you think a two-party system is the best option, or do you think there should be more than two options?
Ideally, I'd love there to be more than two options. I don't see that as practical. However, we've only restructured the American political system 3, 4, 5 times over the course of our entire history. And the last time we functionally did that, if you will, was essentially at the period after the New Deal. That structural system kept itself essentially intact, with one exception in American society, which is after the civil rights movement and after the Republican essentially enthusiasm for bringing voters in the South, white voters in the South, who were unhappy with the progression of civil rights, away from the Democratic Party, which had been the traditional party in the South, into the Republican Party. We see a complete transformation of the political system, all of which, as I say, is, to back up, we see very few times in American history that you have a series of a full breakdown of the bipartisan system. We may actually be facing one now, because we have all discussed for many years now how the discussions within the Republican Party over Donald Trump have essentially opened up a fissure, a civil war, if you will, within the Republican Party. And it's still not clear, though I think I would start to be more comfortable placing bets, it's still not clear which side of the Republican faction is going to win, the Trump party, or if you will, the never Trump party. If there is an actual break in the party, what that usually does historically is bring down the other party within the ensuing decade. That is to say, if the Republican Party comes apart, and think about your political spectrum here, if the Republican Party comes apart and the people who get to own the Republican brand are those on the far right of the party, well, then people in the middle of the party are going to become disaffected, and they are very likely to join up with the people on the right wing of the Democratic Party. So you could, within a series of years, if the Republican Party cracks up, as is not unlikely at this point, you could see essentially a series of dominoes fall where you would get a multi-party system within 10 years. This is the exact scenario that occurred, for example, in the 1850s. Now, unfortunately, that with the example, the end result of that was the Civil War. So I hope that we're not going down that road necessarily, but there are a few times in American history that we've seen the bi-party system, the two-party system, break down into a multi-party system. It coalesces soon after, but there is a general fissure in the middle where change is possible.
Yikes with the Civil War. But do you think that the Republican Party is much more likely to fracture than the Democratic Party?
Is more likely to fracture first. I think that the same structural problems of right versus left, if you will, are at play within the Democratic Party as well. And I mean, the Democratic Party has never been unified since the beginning of the Democratic Party. I'll remind everybody of the great Will Rogers line about the Democratic Party, where he said, "I'm not a member of an organized political party, I'm a Democrat." And that's always been the case. It's always been more of a coalition party. So that is ready to break essentially whenever the system starts to shake. The Republican Party, which has typically, historically been more unified, especially since 1945, and especially after that shift after the Civil Rights Movement, that's the party where I think we're seeing the most open fissure at this point, which is to say, if you think about the way in which the campaign of 2016 broke down, you had essentially people within 2016 on the Republican side saying, we love Trump or anyone but Trump. Well, that tells me that there's an ideological split. And frankly, by the way, I would tell you that one of the other problems is that it's very difficult as a historian, as a political scientist, to define exactly what President Trump stands for. He seems to stand for a series of sometimes ideologically conflicting ideas that are useful for him in the political moment. That's not a good way to build a party over time. So there's tension within the Republican Party that I think is more likely to fissure at this point. And when it does, that's going to allow the Democrats to say, well, maybe we need to fissure too, because right now the only thing that's keeping us together is that we're not Republicans. But if the only thing keeping us together is that we're not Republicans and we don't know which side are actually the Republicans anymore, well, that allows us to reconsider our priorities as well.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds just like a lack of identity is going on with both parties. So the U.S. president has always been involved heavily in terms of overseas affairs. How do you gauge Biden's response to the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, and how does that compare to other wartime
So
presidents?
I got to tell you, I actually am very bullish on the way the Biden administration has handled this thus far. I would give them probably an A- at this point for what they've done. And I'd be tempted to give them an A, except I don't want them to get complacent. I want them to keep working at things. I have to start whenever we talk about Ukraine in noting that foreign affairs in particular is an area where you're sometimes confronted with problems you don't want and topics you don't want to deal with. So a president might run for office saying, I want to fix healthcare. I want to fix Social Security. I want to fix crime. Those are all incredibly difficult topics, but at least they're the ones that he or she has chosen to focus upon. Foreign affairs, there's often something that comes in from left field. So if you and I have been having this discussion 2.5 years ago, and you asked me to list where are the top 15 places in the world that something could go wrong, yeah, Ukraine would have been in the top 15, but I wouldn't have given it a very high likelihood. By the way, I wouldn't have given a pandemic a high likelihood 2.5 years earlier. So there are things that come in from left field. And so everything that the administration has done in Ukraine is by definition reactive. So you essentially need to grade on a curve because you don't get the policies you want when you are in a reactive situation. You get the policies you need. And I think the administration's been remarkably effective in doing three things in particular. The first is, frankly, enabling the Ukrainians to keep going, but not going too far. Which is to say, the real tension for the Biden administration has been, we want to help our allies in Ukraine, but we don't want to give them enough weaponry to expand the war. And so far, they have been really titrating the ability for Ukrainians to use offensive force very effectively. That's no guarantee that that will continue, but so far, so good. The second thing that they've done is they've managed to give enough for Ukraine still to survive. I mean, if you and I had this discussion in the first week of the Ukrainian war back in the end of February, if we had said, 125 days from now, we're going to be discussing what part of Eastern Ukraine the boundary will settle upon, the Biden administration would have taken that as a win. Because at that point, we were discussing, of course, Russian troops being in Kiev within 48 hours. Well, here we are 128 days later, and the fighting has moved further to the east, to the Russian side. So that's a win from the Biden administration. And the third and most important thing is the Biden administration has really focused upon our allies in doing this. And this, I think, is hard for the American people to see, because this is the kind of quiet diplomacy that often reaps benefits without getting any headlines, in that we have really managed to solidify NATO in a way that perhaps it has not been solidified, arguably, perhaps maybe in its entire history, maybe not since 1956 and the Hungarian crisis has NATO been this unified against an outside threat. And we know this because there are two things: other countries joining NATO that for years Finland and Sweden said they would not. And then the most remarkable thing from a historical perspective is this crisis has actually gotten the Germans, of all people, to step up and say, well, maybe we do need to play more of a military role. Now, as a historian, I'm uncomfortable anytime I say increased German military role. Historically, that doesn't always work out so great. But in the 21st century, at least, we have a situation where the Germans, who of course are the largest economy in Europe, have decided for the first time, perhaps in 65, 70 years, that they are going to actually put their money where their mouth is militarily. And I'll give you one example of this that should just completely blow your mind in a sort of sense of how this probably is going to play out in the end. The German parliament, about 3 weeks into the conflict, decided that they were going to up their military spending by $100 billion. Now, that's not their total military spending. That's new military spending by $100 billion. And they have the money, so they essentially said, we're going to put it on a credit card. The total Russian budget annually for the military is only about $70 billion. So what that tells us is one NATO ally, granted a big one, but one NATO ally was able to essentially just flick a switch and economically pump in more money into their military than the Russians spend in an entire year for their entire military. That gives you a sense, I think, of the disparity of power that the administration is trying to leverage.
Now, so we've had, over time, we've had some amazing presidents and we've had some not so amazing presidents. What would you say is the unifying trait of America's best presidents?
Well, wow, that's a great, I've never
been
asked that question in quite that way before. I mean, first thing to always note about the presidents is that we're dealing with an extraordinarily small sample size. I mean, you're a scientist and a doctor, and if I came to you with any study that said, okay, I have 45 examples, you would say, go get more, before you can draw any actual conclusions. I think the most, this is going to sound like a cop-out answer, but I think it's actually really an important one. I think the most important unifying factor for successful presidents is good luck, which is to say, we like to blame presidents when things go bad. That is to say, gas is very expensive now, so you'll see people on the street with signs saying, thank you, Biden, for high gas prices. And the president gets a lot of credit when things go well. Too much credit in both directions. They're kind of like a quarterback. The quarterback is the only player on the team that gets a win-loss record,
Right.
unless, they're only one of 22 players on a football team at any one particular time, at least on the field. 11 at a time. I understand how football works. And, so the president gets way too much credit. So I think for a president to be successful, typically it's because they come in at a particularly good time. Let me give you a couple of examples. Bill Clinton, I think, is actually an easy recent example. Bill Clinton, put aside his personal scandals and problems, was overall a remarkably popular president throughout his time in office. And why? Well, the economy basically went up during the 8 years that he was in office, and there was largely peace. Well, if you come in at a time when the Cold War has ended, the greatest geopolitical struggle of the last 40 years, we just won, and the economy from the 1980s, which had been up and down and up and down and up and down. Remember, the nearest thing that we have to an analogy for today's economic crisis of inflation is 1982. If the economy had worked itself out of those problems by the end of the 80s and that new weird thing called the internet pops on the scene. By the way, Al Gore did not invent the internet, neither did Bill Clinton, but they both benefited from it when they were in the executive branch. You're essentially primed for good success. By the same token, Herbert Hoover, who one could really make the argument was the best prepared president we've ever had in history, at least is in the top 5, I would say. And certainly if you want to rank presidents in terms of IQ, I would put Herbert Hoover in the top 5. Well, he has the unfortunate instance of coming in right essentially at the time when the Great Depression begins. Now, Herbert Hoover, I want to be clear, I think handled, and most historians agree, most, not all, handled the Depression poorly. But even if he had handled it masterfully, I think it still would have been a tremendous decline for the United States, which is to say, if you take office and 6 months later, the worst economic crisis of the century hits your country, it doesn't matter how good you are, you're going to go down in history as a guy who gets some blame. So luck is, I think, really the key factor.
Now, you mentioned kind of, obviously, like you just said, luck and kind of catastrophes that go on. Obviously, this pandemic, an incredible challenge for any president in any country to handle. What would you say are 3 other examples of kind of defining moments in presidential history where there's an issue like a pandemic or like the Great Depression that have really changed the face of the presidency?
Oh, well, the biggest one, I think, is obviously the Civil War. Which is to say, and then World War II, and then I would actually say, honestly, the Cold War, which is to say, at each instance that there's a broad international crisis, and or at least national crisis in terms of the Civil War, we see the power of the presidency increase exponentially. And what's critical about this, and I want everybody to imagine a graph, if you will, where you're tracking power over time, and the line for the power goes up. And then whenever there's a crisis, Civil War, World War II, Cold War, it spikes up. But when the crisis is over, it returns, but never returns down to as far as it was before the crisis. So essentially you get an accumulation of power over time. And so I would say Civil War is clearly the first instance, World War I and World War II, and the Cold War second. And then I could give you some instances where presidential power has to some extent eroded, Watergate honestly being the best example, Watergate and Vietnam coming back to back. We see a decline in presidential authority, a decline in presidential power, a decline in the way that people trusted the office of the presidency, but it never recedes as far as it was before those aforementioned crises. So there's essentially, in the modern world, especially when the president has what Theodore Roosevelt first referred to as the bully pulpit, as to say they're the one who can get on the television screen any time they want, they have a natural advantage in how to accumulate public opinion for good or for ill, but people naturally default back to wanting a powerful and strong executive.
So let me ask you a simple yet very difficult question. In your opinion, who is the best U.S. president of all time and why?
I like to answer that in 2 ways, actually, if I could. There's my favorite, and then there's one who I probably would give the most credit to. My favorite is Theodore Roosevelt. Why? Because he was, well, first of all, he was a historian, so what's not to like? Second of all, he was extraordinarily energetic, and believed passionately in the things he believed in, which frankly is, I think, an admirable quality for a politician. And Theodore Roosevelt also managed to be a very conservative man who over time decided to adopt progressive strategies in order to right what he considered to be structural wrongs within the country. That is to say, he's a president who learned over time, who was willing to concede over time and to change his ideological leanings over time when he thought the nation required it. So I give him a lot of personal credit. In terms of best, unfortunately, to be best, you have to have the greatest crises. So the people that we consider traditionally our top three of presidents, there's almost no argument except to where to put these within 1, 2, or 3, were Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. And of course, the thing that unifies each of them is they're the ones who faced the only 3 genuinely existential crises of the United States, being the founding of the country, the Civil War, and then the Great Depression, not World War II, but the Great Depression. So because of the complexities of the issue, I tend to lean ever so slightly towards Franklin Roosevelt, just because I think he was in office so long, obviously, and had such a complex dynamic in terms of which president had the most fortitude. I think there's no doubt that it was Abraham Lincoln at that point. But again, I have to stress, we don't know what Bill Clinton or Dwight Eisenhower or Millard Fillmore would have done in a similar crisis moment. And of course, most of them should have been glad to say that they never had the opportunity to find out.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a very controversial question. I think it's very timely given the whole January 6th investigation. I think many of us take American democracy for granted, that this will always be the way it is and it can never be overthrown. But in your opinion, could a modern day U.S. president, if all the cards align, realistically launch a coup, take over the government, and become an autocrat or a dictator here in the USA?
Most definitely. I think the institutions that we hold dear to and think are strong are actually only as strong as each generation wants them to be. And again, I'll try to say this in a nonpartisan way. Whether or not you agree, for example, with the Supreme Court's decision on Roe v. Wade in the last week, doesn't matter whether you agree, the same point is the same, which is to say that it demonstrates that no right, no problem, no institution is set in concrete. Things can come back and change over time. Decisions that we thought were set for 50 years can be reversed and vice versa. So I think one of the things that we're seeing from the January 6th committee, which should terrify people, in my opinion, is that there was a much more thoughtful and concerted effort on behalf of the Trump administration, the Trump White House at least, to try to nullify results of the election. Now, I think that statement is true, whether or not one thinks the election was stolen or the election was fair, in which case you would think that Trump was wise to do it or illegal to do what he did. We can all agree that there's clearly a much more concerted effort going on here to change the results of what the decision of the voters appeared to have been. So it is, I think, a small likelihood that that coup would have ultimately worked, but it's much greater chance that the coup worked than I would have thought of before it began. This was clearly much more thought out. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of this. We know, for example, and I don't think there's any disputing this whatsoever, that President Trump wanted to go to the Capitol on January 6th. Now, I would ask people watching to ask themselves, what did he think he was going to do there? Well, most likely it appears that he was going to hope that his vice president would nullify the results and he would stride in somewhat triumphantly into the Congress and declare a state of emergency, declare that this election was rigged, was broken. We need to, who knows, run it again. We need to send it back to the states. We need to do something. And I'm going to declare a state of emergency in order to get things right till we can get this settled up. Historically, states of emergencies are how fascists and autocrats take power and then retain them for years and years and years and years after. I can give you any thousands of examples, but the most obvious one, though I'm hesitant to use it because it takes us to weird extremes, I don't mean to, but Hitler in 1933, when he took power, I'm not saying Trump is Hitler, I'm not saying that Trump was going to lead to where Hitler led, but Hitler in 1933, when he took power, used a crisis to declare a state of emergency, which he then retained. When a president declares a state of emergency, when any leader declares a state of emergency, you're essentially taking the big snow globe, if you will, that is rights and rules and laws, and shaking it. And you really don't know where it's going to come down at the end. And I think that was President Trump's plan, which again, I think is much more likely to have succeeded than I would have thought 18 months ago.
Wow. I'm still trying to just take in what you just said because it's so crazy. Last question, just because I know you're super busy. It's been over half an hour, but give us your crystal ball view. How do you see the U.S. presidency evolving over the next 5, 10, 20 years?
Yeah, I'm
Are you there?
That's there's so many different options you could go. I will give you one of two possibilities. I think that the key question for 2024 in my mind, and then subsequently obviously for 2028, is whether or not people across the board, or at least a majority of Americans, believe the results of those elections are legitimate. So if we have a situation where a Republican or a Democrat wins in 2024, I suspect it won't be Biden for the Democrats, and I don't know who is going to be for the Republicans. Let's say DeSantis. Let's say that Trump is not a part, though again, rules don't apply for Donald Trump. So anything any historian would tell you about what Donald Trump is going to do, they're lying, because the rules, all historical rules, don't apply. I think if a normal Republican or a normal Democrat wins in 24, and people on both sides of the aisle can say, yeah, I may not be happy with that result, but it was a legit election, then we're in good shape for that presidency to at least continue and for the normal patterns to exist. If we have another election, such as we had in 2020, such as we had in 1860, where half the country rejects the results before the event has been finalized, then I'm very worried. Then I would just suggest everyone start looking for, citizenship in New Zealand.
God, I feel the same way. Listen, Jeffrey, awesome interview, terrifying, yet informative.
I hate some of the answers I come to these days.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think the country is in a real bad situation right now. And obviously, you know more about this than anyone else on the planet. So I feel like you're the authority, and your view, again, as I said, while informative, is terrifying. Hopefully things settle down. Like you said, hopefully we get some moderates, some normal people in office, and this all settles down. But it's anyone's guess. So fingers crossed, man. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great weekend, and really appreciate you being on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure to talk, and thank you everybody for your time.